Great. Yeah, thanks, Evan. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today to engage in this important and complex and sometimes a weighty topic of ag leases. So I'm Margaret Rossano. I'm a program manager in the Equity and Conservation on Working Lands Department with California FarmLink. And so in my role, I spend a lot of time working with farmers and ranchers and landholders of various types on lease agreements and other related agreements. And so I've had the opportunity to review a lot of leases, to work on a lot of leases over the past few years. And I'm just constantly reminded in that work how important education and support is for farmers and ranchers and also landholders as they enter into these types of agreements that have such big implications. But I know what's most valuable to you all is to hear from other farmers and ranchers about their experiences. And so I am thrilled to have joining me today two experienced and wise farmers, Dee Boyce of Root Down Farm in Pescadero and Antonio Garza of Feeding Crane Farm in Penn Valley. And we're going to give them a chance to introduce themselves in a lot more detail a little later. But basically, the plan for today is I'm going to start us off just walking through some lease basics and best practices. And then that will set us up to kind of dig more into those topics. And we really want to leave the majority of our time for discussion together and also to answer questions that you all may have and address topics that may come up in the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. All right. Hopefully you all can see the presentation. Yes?
Looks
Okay.
great.
All right.
And just let me know when you want to launch that poll too.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that now. So Evan's going to launch a poll just to kind of get a little better sense of who's with us in the virtual room. Um, that's always that's always helpful to know for these conversations. All right. So just for those who may not be familiar, California FarmLink is a nonprofit founded in 1999. So we've been around for a little over 25 years. And since 2013, we've been a certified community development financial institution. So we are also a mission-based lender and are fairly unique in our focus on sustainable ag. Our programs and services are available across the state, and our mission is to invest in the prosperity and well-being of farmers, ranchers, and fishers who have limited access to financial resources, including beginning farmers and small-scale farmers. And so I think, I'm probably just preaching to the choir here, but the farmers and ranchers that FarmLink serves and that I know many of our fellow service providers are working with face a lot of barriers to accessing capital, business education, and of course, land, which are really the foundations for a viable and sustainable business. And so I just want to, as we go into this conversation about leases, to just recognize and ground us in the reality that a lot of these challenges that folks are facing with land access are also informing the context in which they're entering into these types of agreements. And at FarmLink, our land-focused work is housed in our equity and conservation on working lands department, which is kind of a mouthful, but that's where our programs and our technical assistants that focus on increasing opportunities to secure tenure and keeping land in ag production are housed. And that includes our land portal, which is an online user-generated system for landholders and land seekers to connect about land opportunities. We also offer a succession planning education program, the Regenerator, which we'll be offering again this fall, and some other one-on-one technical assistance. And of course, we have a pretty full suite of agreement building services. So that includes developing and negotiating lease agreements, also reviewing agreements. And that includes working not just with individual parties, but also with organizations such as land trusts, nonprofits, cities, agencies, who may also be entering into a land holding capacity and may be working on various types of land tenure projects. So to get into our leasing portion of this, in terms of best practices, I think the
Want to check out
starting point,
these poll results here?
yeah,
All right, there you are.
great. So it looks like we have a fair number of service providers, but also farmers and ranchers who are planning to lease land, pretty even split. And then a couple operating landowners or folks who are already leasing land. So great, a good variety of folks with us today. So just wanting to emphasize, as far as the ag lease process, that the starting point really ideally is going to be around assessing the land opportunity, and that includes many aspects, including, I think, the relational aspects of that. In my work, I do see a lot of situations where people get pretty far down the road of negotiating or entering into an agreement, and that due diligence or some of that foundational knowledge didn't really occur, which could be for a lot of reasons, and that really causes problems down the road. But the more clear and transparent that information is, the more kind of due diligence and opportunity you have to gather that information. I think the better prepared that both parties are going to be for developing and negotiating an agreement, the more likely it is that potential risks that are specific to that situation are going to be captured and addressed. And I think, again, just to say that, yes, there's assessing kind of the land, the infrastructure for your intended use, but also there's an aspect to it of assessing the person with whom you're entering into an agreement. And I think our panelists can maybe speak more to that as well. So again, just to focus on the fact that the process of lease development is really important. So there's lots of very understandable reasons why farmers and ranchers may feel pressured and rushed to enter into an agreement, to sign an agreement. But taking that necessary time to discuss the possible agreement is really vital. And sometimes that process may allow you to determine that things aren't going to work out, and perhaps it's better to walk away before you get too far down the road. Sometimes that can be the best outcome, even though, that is a lot easier to say than do. So it's really important to have a written lease. This may seem pretty basic, but there is also a fairly strong culture of handshake agreements and kind of a tradition of handshake agreements. And I continue to see a lot of situations where folks don't have written leases, or they may have a written lease, but it's pretty minimal. Or another thing that comes up a lot is they have a written lease, but then maybe you've made some other kind of agreements or understandings along the way. Maybe you verbally agreed, like, yeah, we're going to talk at this time, or we agree to this about renewal, or I'm going to, do this extra cleanup or preparation of the property, and then there will be a rent reduction. And I think we see a lot that those understandings don't end up in writing, and therefore it's kind of like they didn't exist. So it's really important to have that written agreement that provides a common place that you can refer back to um, as things may arise over the course of the agreement. And it also provides some opportunity or some guidelines in terms of conflict resolution or consequences if there is an unfortunate situation where you end up in some kind of a dispute. And of course, there's a lot of other places that care about you having a written agreement as well. A lease contract conveys property rights and, authority to use the land. And so if you are a farmer or rancher who doesn't own land, it's really beneficial to have a written agreement because it's going to open up and make a lot more accessible financing and other kinds of funding and program opportunities. All of these, whether it's a cost share program or organic certification, you're going to be asked for your written lease agreement for those. Um, so these are what FarmLink often talks about and considers to be elements of a good lease. We definitely see a lot of cases where all of these elements may not be included. I think I'm not going to take time to go into the details of these, but I think our panelists can definitely speak to considerations and pitfalls with all of these different types of elements. And just to say that all of these are really important to help, minimize risk and protect yourself and your business in an agreement. Um, of course, there's a lot of different ways to structure a lease, particularly around rent structure, but also there might be different options or rights that you want to include. And so just to note that it's important to think about what is the right lease structure for your situation. And even within what we might think of as a pretty standard cash lease, you could have different rent defined for different types of things. There could be additional fees. You want to think about, utilities or other costs. Maybe there's housing included as part of the lease. And does that have different conditions, different rent as well? And then, of course, and again, I think our panelists can really speak to this, but an appropriate term length is really crucial to land security and for effective planning and business viability. And I think the big takeaway is that the term ideally is going to match the intended use on the property. And then there are, beyond the elements of a good lease, there are a lot of additional clauses and things that come up pretty commonly that you may want to include in your lease, and that will also, help minimize risk or capture value that maybe you as a farmer or rancher bring to the agreement. And I think particularly when it comes to leases with pathways to ownership, this is really a big one to be mindful about how to mitigate risk under those types of agreements. So, for example, you want to be really clear about what is the pathway? Is it a right of first refusal? Is it a right of first offer? Do you have an option to purchase? Those are all different and have kind of different levels of security. Um, and then, I think we see a lot of cases where folks might have an opportunity to purchase and they get into a situation where, they are kind of thinking of it as lease to earn, and they perhaps enter into a situation where they're paying more than market rate because the idea is that money is supposed to be going towards a purchase. But there's a lot of things to keep in mind to really structure that um, to protect your investment. And I think another big one that comes up a lot with these types of pathways to ownership opportunities is around making major investments without having secure tenure or without really having it clear um, how those investments are going to be acknowledged or reflected if and when that purchase actually occurs. Um, so that's just kind of one aspect of all these different optional elements, and I'm sure we're going to get into the details of that in our panel discussion. And FarmLink is here to help with lease agreements. So definitely for anyone who has questions or would like to make an inquiry for support, please feel free to reach out to us. You can submit an agreement inquiry or email us. And here is my contact info. Um, if folks want to get in touch or want to talk through specific questions. And I will also be sharing a copy of these slides after the workshop too. So those will be available in Sketch for if folks want to take another look at them. So I am going to stop sharing, and we're going to transition over to the um, the more engaging part of this workshop. So I'm going to go ahead and give Dee Dee and Antonio an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some discussion. So I guess who wants to go first? Dee Dee, do you want to start us off? And um, if you can just share a little bit more about your business and who you are, and then also just maybe some details around your current land tenure situation.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Dee Dee Boyce, and I own and run Root Down Farm in Pescadero, California. It's about an hour south of San Francisco on the coast. Sweet little farming town. I live here with my wife and our two kiddos. And we lease 54 acres from a land trust in the area called the Peninsula Open Space Trust. And we're going into our 13th year. And what we raise is on those 54 acres. We pasture raise chickens, ducks, turkeys, pigs, and sell all of that as meat at two big San Francisco farmers markets, and then a couple Bay Area restaurants, stores, butcher shops, and we just to give you like a scale idea, so this year we'll raise about, these numbers are approximate, raise about 3,500 chickens, about 6,500 ducks, and 600 turkeys, 170 pigs. So that's grown a lot over the years. And we have 8 guard dogs, keeping them all safe, and the 2 kids that are also pasture raised. So yeah, that's kind of our operation in a nutshell. It's just myself. I have 2 full-time farm employees and a handful of other part-time employees. So pretty small but mighty crew. So yeah, like I said, we're in our 13th year. The lease we started was 13 years ago, started with a 1-year lease. At that time, everything was new. I started the business with a partner at the time, a business partner, and that was new. Our farm business was new. The lease was new, so it felt safe for everybody to just do a 1-year lease. But after that, then we signed a 5 to 10-year lease, which basically was like at the end of the 5th year, assuming we're doing everything in line with each other, we sign on for another 5 years. And so I think the second or third year is when we started planting fruit trees, which I think is metaphorical in a lot of ways of putting roots down, knowing that you can actually be on a piece of land for a while. So it's kind of been gradual for us. And then now we are we just signed a new lease back at the very end of November with an option to buy at that. So basically we have to kind of put in layman's terms, we have two with an optional 3 years to come up with a down payment. And then at the end of that time, we will purchase the land. And that is kind of our general land situation. And so I'll hand it on over to Antonio.
Right. I'm Antonio Garza, with my wife and my 5.5-year-old daughter. We farm Feeding Crane Farm in Penn Valley. It's a total of 13.5 acres of mixed vegetables, pretty much everything, on 2 separate properties, 2 separate landowners. We're in 2-year leases on both properties. The main property, we've been there for 5 years now, and we're in discussions on a long-term lease that'll hopefully take me to the end of my career and allow me the space to transfer it on to somebody else or facilitate the transfer to somebody else in the future. On the other property, we're going to stay in short-term leases while they figure out intergenerational land transfer over there. It's a different sort of situation. In neither one of these places do I really see a path to ownership. They're solid in the families. The families want to hold on to them. But we as farmers provide stability and use of the land because the next generation is not actively involved in the kind of farming that we do. So there's sort of a mutual benefit that doesn't extend to ownership, and that's just fine. Properties in this area are quite expensive, and so it's more viable for me to build a business on leased land than to worry about buying as much land as I would really like to farm here. Trying to think what else did we sell a mixture of direct and wholesale, and we're also planning on starting up a farm stand on one of the properties that has good public access built around a cooler that we're getting through California Farm Link, their solar cooler program. That's really very exciting to us this year. And I've been farming on leased land my entire career from when I was an apprentice at a nonprofit farm that was leasing county land to now, even when I helped start a different farm in the Sacramento region that was on family land of the farm owner. They had a lease because it was an intergenerational ownership situation. So I really, even if it's in your family, you're going to want to lease because it's really all about relationships. And we'll get into that, I think, more in just a bit.
Great. Yeah, thanks, both of you. So I think for our first question, or really more of a topic, because it's pretty broad, just to go back to that kind of initial stage that we were talking about in terms of assessing a land opportunity. So I'm curious to hear from both of you with whether it's a previous situation or your current situation, what kind of assessment did you do? Did you find it easy to get the information that you needed? Where were you going to seek out that information or assistance? And I think also, how were you able, or did you feel able to assess who the landholder was as well? Like maybe speaking a little bit to that relationship building piece. too. So whoever wants to start that off.
I'll jump in there. We're both going to do it. Um, yeah, so I think when you're starting out, it's really hard to know what you need to know. And I think that it can be really, really helpful to not only bring in organizations like FarmLink who have definitely a lot of information around leases and the details of how to figure that out. But I think one of the things that was the most helpful for me was knowing the people that were here before me and that were farming this land before me and even before them. So that the past few farmers, and just understanding the land as a whole and what its basically what its pros and cons were, what kind of really big issues there are. Because I mean, as anyone who's in touch with the land knows, you just don't know until you spend time somewhere, at least a year, if not many, what happens during different seasons and what floods, what all the different things that you just don't know until you're there, how the water system works, what breaks on it, how to fix it, like all these things that the previous tenants really hold a lot of that information. And so I think if you can speak to who was there before you or whoever, if there was somebody managing the land, even if it was the landowner, just getting as much information as you can. And another piece I want to just touch on is that regenerative ranching, organic farming, it has a lot of benefits for the land. And so just remembering and holding tight to the fact that what we're doing is helpful, is like an asset to the landowner. It's not necessarily that we are like the ones who want. It's like it can be a really important relationship that you can build together, because what we're offering as farmers and ranchers is really impactful and just like it just can really, really help out the property as a whole. So just understanding that you have something to offer.
Yeah, I'd say I had two main criteria when evaluating land. One is that I had pretty limited resources starting up a farm, so getting something that was ready to go. So both properties had been farmed in the past. They had deer fences, they had irrigation. There were improvements that I needed to make for, a wash and pack for my specific sort of approach to farming, but I could step onto the land and get going pretty much immediately, which was really important because particularly for the main property we're on, I was making a quick transition from another farm I'd been leasing in the county to this farm. And I didn't want to have to pull up another job before starting farming. So I needed it to all sort of cash flow continuously. And the other thing, and I wouldn't say more important, but just as important, is the relationship. Am I going to get along with this person? What went wrong with the last lease? There was various family dynamics, but a lot of it was just personal. He wanted the farm to look a certain way. That isn't my inclination as a way to farm. He was a farmer as well. I was taking over his operation. That's a very complex relationship. And so making sure you're dealing with landowners who have broadly similar ways of farming. I mean, one of the most encouraging things that I saw coming into this new property I'm on, he was farming winter squash, was there a lot of weeds. Some farmers might find that discouraging or be like, what's going on here? I was like, oh, he's not going to be on me if I'm weedy. I'm still trying to get a crop, everything, but like I don't mind some weeds. And so I think we can have some commonality. So making sure that you're dealing with landowners that have expectations that are going to work with you personally, I think is hugely important to leasing. And similarly, if you're the landowner, communicating those expectations to somebody else and giving them, essentially the option to opt out, because farming is part art, part science, and that art is sort of like how you do your own thing. And so you're not going to want to be doing that as a leaseor for the landowner if it's just really not the way that you want to be farming.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think I would just echo what Antonio was saying. I think, at FarmLink, we work with both landholders and farmers and ranchers. And so in our role in our agreement building, we're there as multi-partial advocates. We're not there to represent either party or, specifically to advocate on behalf of the farmer. And I think um, something that I do see come up fairly often with landholders is, land seekers, yes, like you also need to have a good understanding of what your needs and expectations are. But I think it sometimes happens with landholders that it could be that they're operating, maybe it's a succession type situation. And as Antonio said, that is a very complex dynamic and relationship. And then on the opposite side, I think we often work with non-operating landowners. So maybe folks that have really good intentions and interests in wanting to make their land available for farming. But it's so important if you are in that position that you also do some due diligence and you really understand what you are offering and what it means to have a lease agreement with a farmer or rancher who is, trying to build their own independent, viable business. I think in lease development and negotiation, we see sometimes complexity and challenges come up just because, both parties, but, in some cases, the landholder may not have fully kind of reflected on their own needs and expectations and what they're looking for. And it takes a lot of time to sort of work through that. And that's time that the farmer has spent, wanting to, or you're thinking that they were moving towards this opportunity. Um, and so before we shift to a next question, Dee, I was also just going to ask quickly, because I think folks might be interested, since you've mentioned that you are leasing and now have a purchase opportunity from a land trust. I'm curious how you were connected with them. I think, there's interest in kind of how to become aware of those types of opportunities.
Mhm. Yeah, I assume you mean originally. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we live in the Bay Area. I mean, most of California is pretty much not necessarily affordable land, especially, if you're not coming into land through family or generational hand, generationally, then it's really challenging to find land, period, let alone find land that is like close to markets and able to be farmed, all the things we're talking about. And so something that's happened in different areas, and especially in California, is land trusts have specifically with the one I've been working with in the last 15 years, they really shift their focus from protecting open space to protecting farmland and transitioning that land into farm, but also into farm ownership. And so basically they've owned this land for about 30 years and have gone through various leases and various people raising and growing different things. But as an organization, they've really shifted their focus into protecting farmland and really getting more people to be on the land. And I think it's a really great way to look for land. I mean, there's different land trusts all over the country, in fact, that are doing similar models. And I think as far as land access goes, it's a creative way to think about leasing and getting your farm going.
Yeah, for sure. I would definitely echo that, and just to share that FarmLink is also actively engaged with and supporting a lot of those projects. So sometimes the landholders that we're working with are in fact land trusts or other kind of conservation institutions as well. So I'm wondering, for both of you, have you experienced a conflict or a dispute with any landholder, or something that's come up in the course of your agreement? And how did you deal with that? How did you navigate that situation?
I guess I'll jump in on this one. In the current leases, no, they've been very smooth thus far, and that's been great. In the last lease, there was a challenge. We were looking at renewing the lease, and at that point, I was leasing the business as well as the farm and the equipment, and so I put out there that I much preferred buying the business as opposed to leasing the business, because de facto a business becomes yours to some extent after you've leased it for a long time. And I preferred to just systematize that, because eventually the customers come to recognize you. And I'd leased the business in part to make sure that everything did follow. So once it did follow, there was value in me buying it. That started a whole cascade of things going on to where eventually the landowner decided to sell. And that was a very complex relationship with relatively short notice. I was informed that I could maybe have a 1-year lease if I stayed on. And then it got to the point where they were requesting things like increased oversight of the business during that final year, and also a non-compete agreement in the markets that we were involved in. And at that point, I think this is really the only time where I've counteroffered, and the counteroffer was, we can leave, or we can farm this year without those things. And it's not where we wanted to be, but it would have, to sign those things would have eventually meant that we needed to leave the community. That it was easier to either work on somebody else's farm or try and start things up right away in spring. This would have been, we were basically in spring at that point. So I think it's very important, if you are in a very conflicted environment, to not make it worse by signing something that's really going to cause you problems down the line. You have other options. It's not to anyone's benefit that you move on such short notice. But I would say part of the problem we'd gotten to there is there hadn't been great communication between the landowner and myself, for sure, for the last year, possibly the past year and a half of a 2-year lease, because just personality difference. I think partially I'm sort of an avoidant person, played a role in that, but also just those expectations of the way the farm would look, the role of the previous farmer in the land. It's helped a lot in this current situation. Also a farmer, but he'll offer me advice if I ask for it. But otherwise, he's like, you're here because you want to do farming how you want to do farming. And so that's been hugely beneficial to making our relationship work much better. The other land, I've known the couple who have it for 7 years, and I've also, they've been friends for a long time, so we haven't had issues there either. So I guess that's what I can speak to so far.
Yeah. Dee Dee, did you want to add anything?
Yeah. I mean, I think, similar to traditional marriages, leasing from a landholder can be a form of marriage in a certain way. And the best thing you can do is communicate as best as possible in any of those relationships. And I think that's what I've learned along the way both as someone leasing land, but also I have subleased parts of my land too. And just, every time learning more and more about communicating and expectations. I mean, we're just talking about the same thing over and over, but it's like you don't know how you expect something to be clean and how someone else's expectations on what clean is very different. I mean, that's just like a very mild example, but it can make a big difference in what that actually means. So communicating, getting things in writing as best as possible, and yeah, understanding expectations and what happens if you don't meet those expectations. I mean, that was something that I really came into the last couple of years, was not understanding my landlord's expectations fully, and not thinking they were entirely clear from the get-go. And looking back, it was just like we just didn't communicate clear enough about what the expectations were, but also what would happen if those were not met. And so I think, time is an amazing teacher, but the more you can kind of go in with eyes wide open and communication as clear as possible, and written down, I think, is always going to be to your advantage.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I cannot echo that enough. I know we're all just kind of saying this over and over again, but having open and clear lines of communication is so important. And I think maintaining that also, I think sometimes it's like, oh, we go through this process, we develop this agreement, and then we like maybe never talk for a really long time. And so even to maybe include in your agreement what the expectations are around a time when you do meet and have a check-in, and also just, yeah, building that relationship so you feel comfortable having open lines of communication. Farming is hard and things happen. And I think feeling comfortable to be able to express that to a landowner as well, so that they can kind of be aware if there's some kind of challenge going on. And I think just to reflect a bit more on what Dee Dee was mentioning, this is why with those elements of a good lease, we really want to emphasize, first of all, having a kind of a clear process around, like, if someone is found in breach of a lease or in default, how do you remedy that? That there is an opportunity to remedy that. I think I often see agreements where it's all that's there is basically like, here are the landowner's remedies for default. And it's like, termination, or we can, seek whatever damages from the tenant. And there's really no options for giving notice if there's some kind of default. What are the steps? What is the timeline? And also, it's often not balanced. So having that apply to both landowner and tenant. And then again, just it's very important to have some kind of dispute resolution language in your agreement. Hopefully, you don't ever have to use it, but I think just setting up an expectation that if there is a conflict, or even just a question, like something that you need to talk about, that you have a process. And hopefully that starts with discussion, but maybe then that also involves moving on to mediation with, a neutral third party. And just to give a shout out to the California Ag Mediation Program, CalAMP. They are a wonderful, amazing resource. They're part of the AMPs that are funded through USDA. And they can support with a wide range of things, but that includes lease disputes, or even just, helping facilitate a discussion, and also succession planning. As Antonio was mentioning, there's a lot of things that come up with a land and business transition. Okay, so maybe just, I know both of you spoke to what your current tenure situations are, and Dee Dee has kind of a pathway to ownership. Antonio is looking at opportunities for really a long-term lease agreement. But I'm just wondering if you could kind of speak to that a little bit more, and then maybe also to that question of managing risks under those types of agreements, or kind of how you think about investments or business planning sort of within the context of that long-term tenure opportunity.
I'll start, Antonio. Yeah, so like I mentioned, we're on a path to purchase now. But I have to be honest, I don't think I definitely wasn't, and I didn't feel the need to be. I was perfectly happy leasing, and I think there's people just have different mentalities of like, they really want to buy, they really want to own something, they really want to own land. Some people don't. Some people it's a lot easier to not. And so I think kind of figuring out what works for you and what's actually possible. For me, it was where my landlords, that's the path they take, is to transfer at the end of their like kind of building up the farm. And so that's what we're doing. And I think to your second question, Margaret, about managing risks. Again, I think it just comes down to communication, and especially around investments, infrastructure improvements, any large ticket items or even small ones, but getting very clear. I mean, I've done that not only as someone leasing from a landlord, like big purchases I've made, but also people that I'm subleasing to, and they're buying big things. Like we're figuring out at what point will I buy them? Will they sell them if they move on? Do we go in together? I mean, there's different. It's like depending on what it is, and sometimes it's a lot simpler, especially if you're just starting off, just to get everything that's very temporary or very mobile. Because in the beginning, like I said, you're just kind of learning everything and what works and what doesn't work, if that land works, if the relationships work. And so having things that aren't permanent until a longer lease is happening, that makes a lot of sense too. So I think, again, just getting as clear as possible, but also kind of, taking baby steps.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. In the near term and medium term, leasing land makes a lot of sense for the reasons I said before, mostly cost. We'd love to buy something, but mostly what I'm looking at in terms of just observing the market is, a place where we could plant a small orchard and then retire on after we were done farming at scale. Because we're at 13 and a half acres. That's still small scale, but we see a potential where it's more acreage than that. And it's easier to lease that land unless we're able to work with a land trust. And there are land trusts in our area. But right now, for financial reasons, it makes sense to lease a lot more land than we can buy for our produce. In terms of minimizing risk, when we moved on to this property, and it's continued to be the case, almost everything is designed to be temporary. My cooler is out of a shipping container. My storage is another shipping container. Irrigation that's not already buried by the landowners is run overground in lay flat pipes. Within, it would be a huge pain, but almost everything could be picked up and moved at both farm sites. It wouldn't be fun, but it could definitely be done. This past year on the site that we're hoping to have a long-term lease on, we did just plant, I think, 140 trees, fruit trees. And that's confidence in the relationship, even though we haven't figured out the details of the lease. Would I plant 4 acres of trees on a relationship without a lease? No, that's a terrible idea. But I love fruit trees, and I was ready to take small risks in that sort of a situation. But otherwise, even in purchasing equipment, looking at like, does this scale up or down depending on if I have to go to a smaller property, because a lot of the properties in this area are smaller because we're in the foothills. So just thinking about equipment and everything in terms of if I have to go, does this still work, has been part of my thought process because of that experience of having to move on relatively short notice. I wanted to not make some of the mistakes that I'd made at the previous property in terms of making really solid infrastructure investments that stayed there.
Yeah, thank you. And, maybe it goes without saying, but again, just in terms of having a written agreement, I think, what Dee Dee and Antonio are both mentioning, it's so important that those investments, as well as these understandings about, okay, is this a movable improvement? And identifying specifically in the agreement that the tenant owns it and what the options are when the agreement ends, or if the agreement ends early, they're going to take it with them. They have an option to sell it to somebody else. Or if we're really talking about permanent infrastructure, and that could include, like Antonio mentioned, an orchard. If you're going to develop an orchard, and if there's a case where you don't have a very long-term lease to do that, what are the provisions in terms of what happens when that tenant may leave? And, is there any sort of buyback or payout for those trees? Is the landowner going to then turn around and lease that orchard out to somebody else? So just getting those things in writing, and sometimes that may not all be known or happen when you first develop the agreement. So also just making sure as time goes on that when those decisions are made, you do an amendment to your agreement and make sure that it gets included and that it is in writing. So Dee Dee, I know you may have to leave a little bit early, but I saw that we have a question in the chat for you. So I was going to go ahead and share that. So this says, if Dee Dee is willing to share thoughts, this person is wondering what steps you and your current landholder post took to kind of maybe get back on the right track, or just maybe improve communication kind of going forward to this next phase of an agreement. Do you have any reflections on what that looked like, and how others might be able to kind of address a similar situation?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to recognize that we have had a pretty long relationship. I was working with them for 10, 11 years before having any kind of things come up, and we've been pretty I don't know, we just worked really well together. I think we were both really supportive of the work each other were doing. And I think I felt that as a tenant since day one. And I watched them as an organization really grow into being more supportive of the farmers and the farmland and that aspect of the work that they're doing. And I felt like my timing and opportunity really came together for me. I think that they were in a place that they were ready to take on. At that time, who was I? I like had worked on farms, I had experience, but I was a big risk for them, and they did it, and they took it on, and I was able to build this whole thing from that support. And so I think it's important, though, although I was touching on the challenging parts, it's important to mention that there was a lot of incredible time before that. And so we have, there is some trust to fall back on. And also, I think that there's there's some really incredible people and organizations to help work through these challenges of these relationships. I leaned a lot on FarmLink and a couple other folks that could help support me. I mean, sometimes it's like I feel like I'm one person against this big organization, and so that can feel really intimidating. And I felt like I just kind of needed like a couple people in my corner that also knew more and different things than I knew. You know, I'm like such an emotional person. I'm just like, but I feel this, I feel this. And I'm like, I need some people to be in there with some facts and like a little more information than just like my feelings. And so anyway, I really leaned on a couple people and organizations to kind of help me through it. And I think that we're in we're in a better place. We know we're all like very clear on what lies ahead and what path we're on and how to get there. And that feels really good.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that's really instructive for others. And yeah, I think, there are challenges that come up, but there's also a lot of support to overcome them. And I think that trust piece is so important. So again, just kind of building that from the beginning. And I think having a kind of a shared vision and values also with, the land holding party. And I think like in this case, that was really true and that was in place. So I had one last question. Dee Dee, do you have to head out?
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
everybody. But did you want to ask me particularly, or did you want to just ask a question to both of us? Because I can probably answer
Well,
something for a couple minutes, but I do got it.
okay. Yeah. Well, so the last kind of structured question before we see if there's any other questions in the chat, is just what do you wish you had known before entering into any of these agreements? So I think you've both spoken to that a little bit, but if there's just anything else that comes to mind for you in reflecting on your past experiences.
I honestly, anything. I feel like I could have known like everything would have been anything and everything would have been helpful. I feel like from when I started to where I am now, it's like a huge jump. And I think that I was really naive, which actually probably worked in my favor. But I don't encourage it. So I think the more information you can get, the more support you can get. I feel like in California, we have so much support with FarmLink, Kitchen Table Advisors, various other organizations that are really set up just to support new farmers. And so I think that the more you can tap into that, the better. The work we're doing is so hard and so taxing that learning how to ask for help is not necessarily a bad. But you're more than welcome to get my information. If anyone has any questions for me specifically, feel free to reach out over email or anything. And thank you, Margaret and Antonio.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dee Dee, for joining us. We really, really appreciate hearing all your insights. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you, Dee Dee.
Bye, Dee Dee.
I would just further something that Dee Dee said earlier about spending more time getting to know the landowner and talking to other people with the current relationships. I've either known them for a while or I did spend time talking to previous tenants and people that worked with them. I haven't done that with all of my leases, and it would be, a good idea to talk with previous employees if they're a farmer or people in the network to understand the person. It's something that I offer to employees now is if you want a reference from past employees, you can get a reference on me too. I think you need to do that on your landowners is just essentially get a reference on them. They're going to be checking into your past because it's a complex relationship, and the more you know, the better it will be for you.
Thanks. All right. curious, do we have any other questions from our audience? No?
You check, there's a couple in the Q&A feature.
Okay.
See Sophia asking about leasing rather than buying. I would say that if you don't have capital or you're not inheriting land, buying can be a huge stressor. It's something that I've looked at other properties, trying to make the payments on a $1.5 million property from farming. You need to have an incredible farming business, particularly on small acreage. So buying is a way of building wealth, but to some extent, it presupposes that you have wealth to build. So, not jumping into that too soon to avoid getting into a huge amount of stress about the payments that you're under.
Yeah, so in the Q&A we have a few more questions. So I think, Antonio, this is a question directly for you. What is the range of cost per acre that you've paid for cropland in the foothills?
Let's see. Let me take a quick estimate. Um, I'm paying between, I think, 1,500 and 2,400 an acre per year, which my understanding is that that's relatively high, particularly if you're down in the flatlands where there's a lot more acreage. In this area, it's a lot cheaper if you're ranching, is my understanding, but you also typically make a lot less per acre ranching. So and I'm willing to pay more in part because these properties already have fences, they already have irrigation. Uh, I'm leasing, this includes equipment to some extent on both farms, which includes risks. I wouldn't say you always want to lease equipment, but again, if you have less money, you can prioritize it and lease equipment that's already existing. So it's a pretty broad range. I'm trying to remember what I paid before per acre, but I'd say I'd pay more than that, but that included a business and other things with that. So it can range a lot. The primary thing that I look at in cost is I factor it into my business plan, and I think to myself, can I make money at these rates, rather than thinking how much is land worth in this area, because there's not very much land available. And it ranges from people saying it's free because I just want to see something happening to quite expensive on the other end. So I'd just say that there is no like fixed price, particularly outside of what I would consider a real agricultural area like the Sacramento Valley, where there's thousands of acres being leased every year. In my area, there's just not a lot.
Yeah, I think I would just echo that. It's fairly common that we get that question from folks that we're working with. And I think, it would be great if there was a direct answer or a magic formula. But I think what Antonio is mentioning about, maybe paying a little more because that infrastructure is already there in place. I think that's a really important point, particularly for landowners who may be looking to enter into a lease agreement. Again, going back to that sort of like assessing your property piece, you may need to realize that the amount, a fair ag lease rate per acre if you have essentially sort of unimproved land or land that may not have been farmed for many years. That's going to be really different because the farmer is going to have to make a lot of investment in order to really have that be productive. And so I think that that's something that that comes up a lot. And yeah, definitely ask other farmers. So this is they're really a great resource, and just trying to kind of get a sense of what the situation is in your specific area, because as Antonio is saying, except for some very specific, like highly intensive areas of agriculture, it varies a lot. I'm seeing a couple of questions here that were, I think for Didi, just thinking, so in terms of a situation where you're leasing from the land trust and kind of what happens, so if you purchase from such a conservation institution, what happens when you as the landowner are ready to then retire, and how are they anticipating or working to keep that land in agriculture? So I can just say generally in most of those situations, either there already is a conservation easement on that property, or in some cases, the land trust is maybe simultaneously putting an easement on the property in the purchase transaction. And so that's extinguishing the development rights and putting restrictions on what can happen on that land. Also, there are some other kinds of deed restrictions that might be employed. So there may additionally be an affirmative ag covenant, stating that that land has to remain an ag, and there may be options to purchase at ag value. So for the land trust essentially to buy that land back if needed, to ensure, like, they essentially have that first right to ensure that it remains in ag, and also to help keep that price affordable. So not going to speak directly to Didi's situation, but I think that those types of restrictions are in place to help preserve that land and keep it in agriculture for farmers in the future. All right, here's a pretty specific question, Antonio. Where do you purchase your fruit trees from?
I got them from Fowler Nursery and Sierra Gold Nursery. They're both sort of, I guess, Sierra Gold is down in the Marysville area. Fowler is outside of Lincoln. For just a few trees, going to a nursery or an online website, these both had, I think, 60 tree minimums for a price break, and you had to get them in bundles of 10, which is, and I was a small purchaser. There's larger price breaks the larger you go. So Fowler does have some amount of single trees for sale, but Sierra Gold is strictly wholesale nurseries. So I would, for just a few trees, I would go to your local nursery.
Okay, here's another question. Any tips for leasing land that was not formerly farmland? So I think, again, I would just emphasize even more strongly in that case, really that like land assessment due diligence piece, whether that's, on your part as the potential lessee, but also for the landholder. And I think in that case, really kind of leaning on the landholder, that there's certain sort of information and assessment that they may need to do. So like a big one that comes up all the time is there water? Is there capacity to irrigate? You know, if you're going to be irrigating crops, what is the water capacity, the water quality? If it's groundwater, you know, is there a functioning pump and what's the condition? And of course, soil. So all of those things that we touched on in the assessment piece, but that's just even more the case for land that may have been fallow for a long time. Maybe it's never been farmed. It's just like, is this suitable for the type of farming that you're trying to do?
I'd also take a look at drainage going out
Mhm.
in a rainstorm, whatever's a large rainstorm for your area. Talking to other landowners in the area around. Sometimes landowners don't really know their land. So I have a friend who's leasing or borrowing someone's land, and the landowner says it gets a little damp in the winter. It's a swamp during the winter. She's leasing the bottom of a bowl, and you don't want that. So I would say if you're in a what can be a high rainfall area, we get 40 to, you know, over 100 inches, depending on where you are in the topography around here in a given winter. Drainage can be huge, particularly if you want to farm during the winter, or if you just want to get started relatively early in the spring. I mean, she will be able to farm it at some point in the summer, but it's taking a good look at things like drainage and getting, you know, if you know any other farmers in your area, have them walk the land with you. If particularly if they're more experienced, just to get some other eyes on the thing. Because sometimes when you really want land or you really need land, you're seeing things through rose-colored glasses, and that can be particularly true of unimproved land. So just getting more eyes on the thing.
Mhm. Yeah, and I see a follow-up question about, you know, are there toolkits or other resources? Along with sharing the slides, I was planning to kind of share out some other resources. So, you know, FarmLink has some information, but also some other orgs, American Farmland Trust, Land for Good. A lot of folks have kind of worked on putting together guides. I know Cooperative Extension for Sonoma County has actually put together a little bit more specific guidance just for that region, for landholders to kind of approach these kinds of issues. So we'll try to share some other resources.
There's also the Web Soil Survey,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
through the federal government. They've mapped the entire United States. I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but it looks very accurate on the online toolkit. And it can give you warnings about things like flooding and tell you just the general soil types, which soil types aren't everything. But if it tells you that, you know, there's a hard pan 6 inches down, you know, to at least take your shovel out there and go and check and make sure there's a hard pan 6 inches down. And you can get sort of that basic information.
Mhm. And also, your resource conservation districts are a great resource as well. I know it varies to some extent, the different programs and capacities they have, but a lot of them, you know, they have agronomists and soil scientists who are there as to provide technical assistance and may be able to help with soil testing, you know, assessing in terms of viability for certain crops, also assessing with irrigation system or you know, connecting you with various programs that might be available either to help with the cost of doing that assessment or you know, to actually implement infrastructure. Um, so I know we're coming up on time here. I see there's this question about a range for grazing livestock leases. I think what I would just say generally there is, again, it's going to depend on the area, but as Antonio mentioned, it's really, really different than for crops. If we're talking about kind of a per acre, we might be seeing more in the like $30 to $50 per acre per year. But then keep in mind also, you might be talking about a much larger acreage for a ranch, for example. but it's really a lot lower. And then there's other ways that those kinds of agreements the rent might be structured. So it could be a per head rate. It could be animal units per month. It could be that people are getting paid on the gain of animals that are grazing. So just going back again to like how to structure the agreement for your specific situation. And yeah, if others have a range with that. And just to also make the distinction, like a grazing lease where you are paying to graze animals is very different, of course, than a grazing contract where you are getting paid to do targeted grazing services, and how that's valued is very different than from what a lease agreement would look like. So,
And I would just toss in there similarly with landowners. So it might be valuable to a landowner just to have you on their property, keeping the weeds down. So, like a large property will have to be mowed and taken care of or grazed or something. So, as a farmer, you can provide some value to a large landowner to be taking care of their land. And different landowners, depending on their financial circumstances, value that different ways.
all right. Well, I think we're at time here. Thank you again, Antonio, for taking time to talk with us and share all of your experience and insights. This has been really a great conversation. And thanks again to everyone for attending. And please, feel free to reach out or follow up with questions. And as I said, we'll make sure that we also share out some additional resources as well after the presentation. So
Yes,
yeah,
thank you guys. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Evan, for holding this. It's been great.
Thank you.
all right. Thanks all. Take care.